So we can go ahead and start our session. So thank you for joining us. So bula everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Youth for Pacific Pre-COP gathering. My name is Dylan Kava, and as you've probably already guessed, I'm going to be your moderator for our Talanoa this morning. Before we begin, I just want us to take a moment. You know, it's been a pretty intense day, and well, a day and a bit, packed with a lot of learnings. And I want us all to just be present in this space and be fully refreshed for a new day of knowledge sharing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to take 2 very deep breaths with me, in through the nose and out through the mouth, right? So we're going to breathe in. Awesome. So that may have been more for me than it was for you, but we'll just go with the flow. So it's good that everyone's feeling good, because I think we're just gonna jump straight into it, because I'm conscious that we only have an hour to dissect personally an area that has been a bit complex to really unpack, and that's obviously climate finance, particularly as a young person. So I want to, before we do that actually, I want to quickly set the scene for us. So the latest climate finance assessment by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, reveals that access to affordable climate finance is lagging in the Pacific. Now, to put things into perspective, you know, we access less than 1% of global climate finance. Most of it, mind you, in the form of loans. So for me, while the amount available for climate finance is increasing globally, we need to address questions around accessibility, removing those barriers. We need to explore questions like, you know, how fairly is the available climate finance arranged or prioritized for the most vulnerable groups? And I really want to bring, you know, that youth focus to this Talanoa as well. So questions around what portion of the climate finance is actually accessible for building resilience in and for young people? How many of the climate projects implemented under various financing mechanisms have involved young people in the planning stages or even beyond? And so that's really, you know, our focus. It's focused on the Pacific, and it's a focus on young people. So I'm going to leave it at that. And to talk more about these questions and issues and concerns, we have a great lineup of speakers joining us. And maybe just as a bit of a background, this is how it's going to work. I'm just going to introduce each speaker just as they deliver their opening remarks. Then once that's done, we'll go into some questions. I have some questions, and I'm sure young people viewing this also have some questions, so we'll try to visit those as well. I know a few speakers have prepared brief PowerPoint presentations. And at this point, actually, I'd like to remind our speakers of our 5 to 7 minute mark that we've allocated to each of you for your opening remarks. So if we could try our best to keep it to that, so we have time for some questions. And I'll ask, at this point, I'll ask Jay. Jay is our tech person. Jay, if you could please line up Ilisapeci's presentation, just as I introduce her. So our first speaker today is going to be Ilisapeci Masivesi. Now, Ilisapeci works with Oxfam in the Pacific. She has over 15 years of experience working in the Pacific around disaster risk management, climate change, and environmental resource management. She holds a Master's of Climate Change from Australian National University and recently completed her Master's in Diplomacy and International Affairs at USP. So Ilisapeci, the floor is yours for your opening remarks.
Vinaka Dylan, and welcome, good morning to everyone. Bula Vinaka, thank you so much for having me. My name is Masivesi, and I'm from Fiji. I want to acknowledge the event host, Youth for Pacific, for inviting me to speak. I'd also like to acknowledge the other speakers on this panel whose well-founded reputation precedes them: Moortaza, Jiwanji, Hansol Park, and Seru. Second slide, please. I would like to begin by stating that as custodians of our resources, we hold our island homes and our Pacific Ocean that surrounds them in trust for future generations, as our ancestors have done for generations before us. Now, as Pacific Islanders, we recognize existing traditional systems that help to promote, foster, and encourage the voices of the marginalized and vulnerable in our communities to challenge existing climate narratives. Now, the question put forward to this session is a fascinating one because it asks us to reevaluate our thinking around climate finance and climate financing instruments. However, to tackle the latter, we need to first explore the former. As such, we have to recognize that climate finance is a political issue. And so as an organization, when tasked with thinking about how climate finance can be improved, we've realized that effective climate finance has to focus on the need to ensure accountable and equitable governance of climate finance. Next slide, please. We've also realized the need to emphasize the distributive impacts of the finance, talking about the effectiveness of the finance, rather than just standalone access. The need for tracking of finance at local level to understand where and who benefits, the need for locally led and owned project and programming, the need for demand-driven accountability rather than supply accountability focus, the need to pilot solutions and technologies that allows equitable and transparent distributions of resources at community level. And finally, enforcing social accountability of climate-related finance, ensuring that finance reaches those that need it most. Put simply, climate finance is a lifeline for communities who face the devastating impacts of tropical cyclones, storms, floods, and sea level rise. Therefore, our ambition at Oxfam is to ensure that climate finance is adequate, predictable, and accessible, that it supports preparedness, adaptation, mitigation, and compensation for loss and damage, especially in the most poor and vulnerable communities, while also ensuring gender equality. Next slide, please. At this juncture, it would be prudent to ask, do climate financing instruments really need to change so that they can be adapted to the Pacific context? To provide you with that answer, allow me to draw from statistics from the OECD and of course, Oxfam's Climate Finance Shadow Report. In 2018 alone, loans represented 74%, which is an equivalent to $46.3 billion of public climate finance, up from $19.8 billion in 2013. Grants, on the other hand, represent just 20%, which is $12.5 billion of public climate finance. This prompted Pacific leaders to speak of the need for development partners to significantly reduce loans as an instrument of climate finance, suggesting unlocking private sector finance as an alternative through grant-based and highly concessional de-risking funds. Now, also in 2018, just 21% or $16.18 billion of all climate finance provided and mobilized was for adaptation. 70% went for mitigation, an equivalent of $55 billion, and 9% was cross-cutting. Now, Pacific leaders have also highlighted that the $100 billion goal is still unmet and shared concerns regarding the insufficient focus of finance on adaptation. Additional statistics from 2016 to 2018 showed that just 14% of climate finance provided and mobilized went to least developed countries and only 2% to small island developing states. The proportion of funding provided in the form of loans was 66% and 50% respectively. Now, to reiterate, A paltry 14% of climate finance went to the least developed nation and just 2% to small island developing states, which has done the least to cause the climate crisis, but are being hit the hardest. Next slide, please. Now, essentially, we know that the quality and quantity of climate finance to developing countries must increase significantly if the world is to have any chance of keeping temperature increase to within the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And those vulnerable to climate change are to get the support to which they are entitled. What we also know is that there is a need for an uncompromising increase in the efforts and commitments that needs to be made to achieve the 1.5 degree goal that was agreed to in Paris that will give the Pacific a chance to survive. I would like to see that the parties of the Paris Agreement and others turn their national climate plans into real action and step up their emission targets. Higher emitters like the G20 group of countries must commit to higher mitigation targets. As we stand, we are in line to achieve a reduction of only 1% by 2030. And this is of great concern, especially for us at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. So action is needed now. Actually, it was needed yesterday. This is where young people come in. This is an expectation. There is an expectation, rather, that the solutions for today's problem will come from the great thinkers of decades past. But I am here to tell you that you cannot keep looking to the past to assure you of the security of your future. The practices and values of the past are what led us to this state in the first place. What is needed from young people now is the courage to call our leaders who refuse to commit to a safer future for you. What is needed from young people now is the need to be assertive about the climate crisis, to call it what it is, an existential crisis that needs to be addressed now. What is needed from young people is for you to embrace your passion, intellectual curiosity, and desire to challenge the norm and reshape the narrative. And in doing so, to demand, not to ask, to demand for a different world. The pandemic has shown us that alternative solutions do exist. The pandemic has also shown us that when push comes to shove, our government can and will act. The time has now come for young people to take the lead, to be that push that will act as the catalyst for change. Next slide, please. Now, to conclude, the statistics and the data that I've referenced in my intervention today is meant to be a rallying call. The science is clear in that there is an immediate need for drastic change, but the statistics shows that we are nowhere near achieving that change. So my ask of you is that you be agents of change. Let your intellect guide you to come up with the solutions to this climate crisis that we so desperately need. Let your philosophy guide you in rethinking the norms and envisioning a different world, one that isn't steeped in a dependence of fossil fuels. Lastly, let your passion guide you to speak up and speak loudly, to address the injustice in this climate crisis, and to demand for an end to the systems and ways of thinking that have led us to the brink of climate disaster.
Thank you, Ilisapeci. Some great points you made there about how climate finance is actually can be a political issue and at times is, and our need to focus on accountable and equitable forms of governance as well is important in this discussion. But then also, I liked how you touched on indigeneity and we being custodians of our resources and our existing traditional systems, and how most of the time, at times, climate finance is actually, in most cases, climate finance is a lifeline for young people and for communities in our region. And the need, there is a big need for adequate, predictable, and accessible climate finance. I think you also talked about a balance between mitigation and adaptation and finance that goes into those. So, you know, a real good intervention there. And the role of young people, I know you touched on the role of young people towards the end, and our role in putting pressure on world leaders. And, you know, if this event is testament to anything, it's to that, it's to youth action. You know, we're confident that we can mobilize ourselves for climate action. And that's what we're doing here today. So thank you for that so much, Ilisapeci. And we're just gonna go into our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Moortaza Jiwanji. Moortaza works at the United Nations Development Program Multi-Country Office and is currently the project manager for the Governance for Resilience project. He holds a master's in business administration and planning from the University of Bristol, as well as a master's in environment and resource economics from UCL. And with that said, with that short introduction, I am going to pass it on to Mr. Jiwanji.
Thanks a lot, Dylan. Thanks. That was an amazing introduction, and Ili, much appreciation for setting the tone, setting the scene. If I could have the slides up as well as a background, just to guide some of the points that I'd like to share this morning. And actually, if you may remember, colleagues, Ili shared a really powerful photo that said something like, it's about systems change, not climate change. And you know, that is really powerful. And I think yesterday, Reverend James also said something similar about societal change and not just climate change. And I'd like to anchor the points to share this morning based on that. So thank you very much, Ili. And also I want to acknowledge Noah. Great to be reconnected with you again, Noah, and nice to meet you, Hansol. I'm going to share a few points based on my experiences managing a project. It's a bit of experimental work in the region. We're doing quite a bit of work on the systems side, if you like, in Tuvalu, Fiji, Tonga, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Vanuatu, and hopefully more. But also some kind of rapid strategic research with the Forum Secretariat and the UK government, UK being, as you know, the COP26 chair, and really trying to unpack this concept of systems change. And, you know, I heard something recently, Ili, actually from Oxfam colleague, and she said, more money never created the required change. So I think yes, it is about advocating and positioning for more money and better quality of money, but I think there's more to it. So if I could start with that on the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to use the concept of the iceberg here, and there's a bit of irony here, of course, how global warming is leading to the melting of ice caps and so on. But we're using the concept of systems thinking, systems modeling, to try and go a little bit deeper. So the idea behind the iceberg model is there are things that you see at the surface level, and that's the tip of the iceberg. And what we're seeing through some of this initial experimental work and research, and Ili has already pointed this out, is that there's some real concerns not only about the quantity of financing, but the quality of financing. Is it really addressing community resilience? Is it really addressing the adaptation needs in the region? One could argue that there's an inevitability about climate change. I mean, Pacific is not a net emitter. And yes, we must advocate for the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but there is an inevitability. And even if we achieve the 1.5 targets and so on, there's a massive lag effect that is already hammering communities across the Pacific in terms of the increased intensity and frequency of events affecting our livelihoods in the Pacific. So I'm going to try and challenge that a bit and sort of go beyond the quantum of financing and actually bring the systems, like what Ili showed in that last slide. What's the required change? So we've tried to go a bit deeper we tried to look at, well, what is the financing being used for currently? So there's 10 years or so or more of experience in the region, about $2 billion worth as a conservative estimate that's already been applied as climate financing. And what is that showing? Are we seeing movement in the vulnerability drivers to climate change at community level or not? And there's real question marks there, to be honest. And then as you go deeper, perhaps there are some institutional factors, societal factors that are perhaps constraining us to achieve that better quality of financing. So again, going beyond the volume of funding, yes, we definitely need more funding, but also what are we doing, what are we using the funding for, and is it working? And is it really influencing that systems change as well as the climate change in the right direction? Now, Ili also said very astutely that climate finance is extremely political. And I think that's the deepest and hardest part of this equation. If you go right down to the bottom of the iceberg, the bit that you really can't see and the toughest bit to address is the political economy of climate finance. And at the moment, a lot of the political dialogue narrative is about the quantum, quite rightly so. But perhaps one could consider lobbying for better quality as well as quantity. And that's something I want to focus on now. Next slide, please. So this slide is a very crude, it's an aspirational slide in a way. So on the bottom side of the curve, you've got more money, please. More access, more direct access, absolutely. But not at the expense of achieving impact on the ground, sustained impact. So in a way, the optimal trajectory of climate finance could and should, and in some ways already is that perfect balance between getting more money and again, in a way that is not burdening Pacific Island countries and communities, but it is helping to actually achieve better impact. Next slide, please. So I'm just throwing around some ideas here. Please do agree, disagree, throw some questions, colleagues, because the idea here is to stir it up a bit. Dylan, thank you. I think it's all your fault. You got us to do some heavy breathing, so you've stimulated us here. So now as we're sort of broadening the debate and looking at effectiveness as well as access to climate finance, a lot of the experimental work we're doing in the countries, and we've got partners like local governments, NGOs, ministries of finance, all the unusual suspects, if you like, not just sort of climate change projects and climate change institutions. And one of the messages we're hearing is that, look, maybe it can go beyond climate finance. I mean, if you really want to address the real drivers of vulnerability, we also need to look at, well, how is our housing constructed? And therefore, how is it financed? How is water supply constructed and located and therefore financed? So perhaps one could also look at development finance and private financing as well as climate financing. And perhaps, and this I think came from the Oxfam study, a fantastic study. I urge everyone to read that shadow report that Ili referenced, is also how can climate finance in itself be a catalyst to influence other types of financing. So even if we get perfect climate financing, what if the financing for the roads and bridges is still done in a way that gets swept away the next time there's a cyclone? So you move one step forward and then 10 steps back. So I'm just putting that out there for your consideration. Next slide, please. Okay, some ideas, potential areas of reform. So I think, sorry, I don't have a pinpointer, but on the left-hand side of the diagram, absolutely, I think from an advocacy point of view, the Pacific and the youth groups should access to lobby for better access and accreditation to climate financing, better deals, not burdensome deals like heavy loans and so on. But I think I'd like to add other things in the mix, and I think the youth voice is really powerful and important here. In-country systems reform, as Reverend James mentioned, not just formal systems, but societal systems, informal and formal. Improving the quality of what climate financing is being used for, so not just projects all over the shop, but a genuine longer-term programmatic offering. and also recalibrating the instruments, and Ili has already touched that, not just a dependency on loads. But finally, more platforms for sharing and learning and testing and taking risk. And I think already this platform is an example of that. So colleagues, I did have one more slide, but I think I've run out of time. I'd like to offer 4 points for youth groups in particular. And I agree with Ili. I think, it's not just about how is climate change affecting the youth and their voice needs to be included. I want to turn that around, that actually youth groups are at the frontier of the future more than anyone else. I mean, there's a time frame dimension here, and actions now are affecting what's going to happen in future generations. So youth groups are at the frontier of the future. So that is the secret ingredient to addressing climate change. And so I'd argue that you could use that to influence decisions that have an impact in the future. So it's not just about including the impact on youth, but youth can actually represent the future impact and solutions. So the second point there is definitely advocacy and raising the bar on the urgency and need to do something and being disruptive about that. That's absolutely key. But I'd like to add there that the youth groups can also be extremely disruptive and loud about the solution set. So it's not just about raising the problem and this is the problem and we're sinking and all that. It's also about raising the bar on the solution set. I think there's a lot of attention needed there. And so the third point is around innovation. What we're learning from the research and experimental work is that there's a lot of linear approaches to climate change, adaptation, mitigation, very rigid, box-like, log frame kind of approach. But this is a wicked problem, and it really requires risk-taking, innovation, agile, non-linear approaches, looking at future scenarios. And again, youth groups have a minefield of energy and capacity to bring that to the table. And last but not least, change does not happen unless you ruffle the feathers. Unless you're creating some sort of tension, that change, that systems change, that societal change to address climate change is not going to happen. And again, there comes the ultimate power and opportunity for youth groups. So Dylan, I hope I haven't overrun my time. I just wanted to end there. Thanks so much for listening and looking forward to more questions and discussion. Naka.
Thanks, Moortaza. Sorry, I just lost where I was. My screens are playing up. But thank you so much for that. And just some key takeaways that I kind of got out of what you were saying. The one that really struck home was, it's a systems change, and that's definitely what's needed. And I think that's something that needs a lot more conversation around. And hopefully we can touch on that a bit later in the session. But then also, the phrase that you said, more money never solved anything. And the push, there's definitely a push, as Ilisapeci said, for not only quantity, but also quality. And, going beyond more funding to effective funding. So great points there. And, I know that you mentioned something about accreditation. I have a question for that on you later. So we can revisit that. You also talked about programmatic climate financing, as opposed to project-based climate financing. So these are just some points that I'm throwing out there in case you're inspired and you want to touch on it in our Q&A section later. That'll be great. And you did mention in your concluding statements about rustling feathers. So trust that we'll be outside your offices come Monday to rustle some feathers. No, I'm joking. But thank you for those comments. And we're definitely going to go straight into our third speaker. Our third speaker for today is Mr. Hansol Park. Hansol is a multilateral governance officer in the Office of Governance Affairs of the Green Climate Fund, strengthening the Green Climate Fund's ability to serve its mandate under various multilateral systems. Prior to joining the Green Climate Fund, he worked for the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. He holds a master's in public policy with a focus on political and economic development from Harvard University. So the floor is yours, Hansol.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I must say that as I was listening to this brilliant presentation delivered by my previous speakers, I saw that there were a lot of overlaps with what I prepared for this meeting. And I must also thank the organizer for sharing with us this very thought-provoking question. And let me just start my intervention. So, and I will stick to the 3 questions that were posed by the organizer so that I can shape my intervention accordingly. So, well, first of all, GCF is a young institution, relatively speaking, compared to other international organizations or IFIs. We are a new institution, and we are trying to address issues that are most pending and urgent, and having this type of dialogues with the people who can share their voices with us so that we can reflect those ideas in a way that we deliver our services is very important. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So regarding first question, so I must first say that we are indeed confronted with a very rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to save ourselves from the climate change crisis. We know that so far average global temperature is already over 1.1 Celsius degrees above pre-industrial times, and such climate risks are more amplified and critical for the Pacific region. So we need to join forces to limit further global warming, and we must help developing countries articulate and realize their climate ambitions as stated in their nationally determined contribution and as well as their national adaptation plan. So to this end, mobilizing climate finance through all available means and channels will be quite critical. So what does GCF do against this backdrop? So GCF business model is truly partnership-centric. We work closely with over 200 accredited entities and delivery partners who work in tandem with developing countries for project design and implementation and throughout the entire project cycle. In the Pacific region, for instance, we have 5 direct access entities and 10 international accredited entities who are supporting our endeavor in this regard. Our comprehensive partnership enables us to foster coalition between unconventional partners and as well as the traditional ones, ranging between private investors, development agencies, and civil society organizations. We also operate a set of modalities to strengthen coordination at the national and regional level and between the stakeholders who are supporting this goal. So we ask our countries to provide us with their vision stated in their country programs, and also the entities who work with us are asked to submit their work programs so we can understand how we can best create synergy by looking at the entire portfolios. So to date, we have identified about 97 really brilliant ideas submitted through the country programs, and as well as more than 44 very good ideas submitted by the entities around the world. And second, GCF is a capital agnostic organization, and this feature actually allows us to crowd in both public and private investment. We leverage a wide range of financial instruments in order to leverage the appetite of various investors. And this feature gives us the ability to catalyze stronger and greater climate finance flows for paradigm shifting investments. For instance, in the Pacific, we have mobilized up to $440 million climate finance, which further leverages $690 million from various co-financiers. In parallel, we organize structured dialogues with the direct stakeholders in order for us to ensure that there is a robust coordination between partners. And this structured dialogues is aimed to be served as an interactive platform to facilitate discussion and also enhance complementarity and coherence across various initiatives on the ground. Only recently, in June 2021, we have organized a programming dialogue in the Pacific region in order for us to ensure there is a common understanding of our funding proposal requirements, and as well as the policies that would be conducive for the stakeholders to come up with a strong and transformative project. Coming back to the second question, Dylan, how can climate finance be leveraged to help reduce climate and disaster risks in the region? Before that, maybe just to give you some context. So as said by my previous speakers, indeed, global climate finance at present is still very scarce compared to what is actually needed. And we need innovative thinking to tackle this conundrum. And climate finance, therefore, should be designed in a way that can effectively catalyze and stimulate greater financial flows, which will result in challenging the status quo of the financial systems overall. So what do we do at the GCF? As many of you know, we are an operating entity of the financial mechanism under the UNFCCC. It's a mouthful word. We are guided by the mandates of the parties of the convention in order for us to deliver on the goals articulated in the convention and as well as in the Paris Agreement. And we channel climate finance to developing countries including in the Pacific region using various funding windows. These include readiness programs, project preparation facility, and projects and programs that are financed with the GCF resources. Our catalytic investment is designed to help the region reduce climate risks, mainly through including investing in building resilience and adaptive capacity of the affected communities. We have delivered about $20 million in grant form, which was accessed by more than 14 countries. We have 16 funding proposals already approved for the region, which is about $1.1 billion size in terms of portfolio. As I said earlier, project preparation support, facility support is also granting necessary technical assistance and grants in various countries who are in need of, for instance, enhancing their resilience within their ecosystem and geographic feature. And lastly, to answer your last question, in terms of how GCF is ensuring the robust presence in youth empowerment within our operation, I can say that youth empowerment and involvement is placed at the core of GCF operation. For instance, various mechanisms and tools exist within the fund actually speaks to it. Our governing instrument actually encourages us to take very ambitious, sorry, it's an alarm, a participatory monitoring and evaluation approach. And this approach actually places very strong emphasis on women and youth participation. Our funding proposals are asked to comply with very robust policy standards to ensure equal and transparent participation of all the traditionally underrepresented groups, including youth. The readiness grant is also used to support strengthening communities' resilience and benefiting youth, women, and other indigenous groups. Finally, at the Secretariat, we also organize various informal sessions in order for us to interact more closely with the youth group. For instance, at the previous COP in Madrid, we have organized a GCF Champions Award, and through which we have awarded young people who made a difference in responding to climate challenge over the world. So as I said earlier, GCF is a young organization like yourself, all of us who are attending this very important event. We've been in operation only for 6 years, and we are ready to learn from the brilliant minds and ideas that are exchanged and offered by great young people. So we look forward to working closely with you and so that we can tackle this global conundrum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hansol. And within 5 minutes, that was amazing. Thank you so much for touching on the amazing work that the Green Climate Fund is doing. I think two kind of key words that really spoke to me that you mentioned were partnership and synergy. And I think that's definitely something that we need a lot of. And it's not more partnership, it's better partnership. And that's kind of a subliminal difference in that understanding. I also you mentioned, climate finance as a catalyst as well. That's an important point. And maybe, just the last bit of what you mentioned about the work that the Green Climate Fund does. You touched on the emphasis of young people and vulnerable groups in your mechanisms. And that's so amazing to hear. And again, this relates to what Moortaza had mentioned in his intervention when he mentioned, youth. We should recognize youth, young people, as not only the leaders of tomorrow, but the leaders of today, because we stand to inherit the actions of today. So thank you for that. At this stage, I would like to maybe start getting some questions in for us. If you've already spoken, if you can just have a look at our chat that's coming in. There's a few great comments by Catherine, and there's a question that Kamal has posed in a Q&A section. So if you could have a read of those. And I want to encourage people watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll get to it at the end. We're moving on to our final speaker. I believe Jay, he may have to use his PowerPoint presentation. He may not have to, just be on standby with that. But with that said, I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Noah Seru. Noah is currently engaged as a senior policy and finance advisor with the USAID-funded Climate Ready Project, a Pacific regional project that focuses on climate financing. He's passionate with development work, particularly in climate change, with specific interest in adaptation and mitigation work, and supporting climate finance initiatives in the Pacific region. Noah holds a Bachelor's of Science from USP, a postgraduate diploma in engineering from the University of Melbourne, and a Master's of Development Practice from the University of Queensland. The floor is yours, Noah.
Thank you, Dylan, for the kind introduction. I might just ask Catherine just to put up the slide, and we can jump straight into the first slide, so that we'll allow more questions and for us to respond to the questions from our audience. And I'll probably, and I'd like to acknowledge our previous speakers for their contributions, and I hope my inputs adds value to the information that's been shared so far. I'll probably take us back, a step back, and look at, okay, now that we're wanting to access climate finances, what do we really need to do? And that's where my focus of my intervention today will be all about. It's about the capacity of Pacific Island countries versus climate finance. So next slide, please. So I think having worked in the Pacific Island countries and engaging with the government, the private sector and NGOs, I believe that prior to accessing climate finances, we as individuals or the Pacific Island countries or institutions really need to assess ourselves as to where do we stand in terms of or where do we see we lack the technical expertise so that we can be able to access climate finances and then secondly, once we've accessed climate finances, how can we implement the projects or programs that have been given to us? And then thirdly, how do we actually report back to the funding institutions, whether it's national, international, bilateral or multilateral institutions. But we need to set ourselves well so that we are positioned well to be able to do these things in order to be able to access the climate finance and then implement the projects appropriately. So in the context of this forum, how do we actually do this with the Pacific youth? I think we should actually use these climate finance instruments and offer more scholarship programs to the youth. Finance participation in formal and non-formal programs that embed climate change into the courses. Going around the Pacific, one thing that we've found is that countries would like more training, but more accredited training is what we're getting. And that is why we've been supporting USP Pacific TAFE in terms of delivering some of the accredited courses out there. I think the other area that we can focus using the climate finance instruments is offer volunteer programs or attachments or apprenticeship. I think private sectors, governments and NGOs should be in a position to do this. We heard yesterday Reverend James Bagwan and Taholo. They mentioned that they're open to having attachments with them, and I think the youth of today should use this opportunity and build up their experience, build up their capacity, and work in these institutions, whether it's a volunteer, whether it's an attachment. But I think these climate financing instruments should be used to sort of finance these kind of initiatives. And I think the third area that we can focus our attention in is looking at brainstorming sessions. Look at forming small brainstorming sessions. Why wait until 2 months before COP and then having this meeting? I think we should start as soon as COP finishes, start having small groups in your communities, in your groups, in your sectors, and build that up in terms of national, and then bringing it up to the regional or even sub-regional, so that when it comes to this point in time, you're only just reaffirming your position, so that it's put out there into the international forum. So I think these are some opportunities out there that private sectors and governments and NGOs can use its climate financing instruments. Next slide, please. So in terms of really leveraging climate finance and creating better platforms, I think what we really need to do is look at our education platforms, review our education system, create innovative. I think some of our speakers have mentioned the word innovation before. I think we need to create innovative exercises into the curriculum. And I think if we do that right from an early age, why wait until when you're in Form 6 or Form 7 or even in university and introducing climate change or climate finance into the curriculum? Embed it into the curriculum in a very early stage, in primary school, in secondary school, so that people are more aware of these issues, and create innovative programs or activities in the school curriculum, whether it's gardening, and then looking. I remember when I was in primary school, in Namboa Primary School, we had a school garden. We were class 1, class 2. We had a garden. I'm not sure what was done with what we planted, but I think we should take it to the next step. Okay, now that we've got carrots and potatoes and whatnot, what can we do with these products? And then once you've got that product, then you try and sell that product. So you've got the whole chain of events. And I think this kind of activities should be looked at or created or something of that sort. Look at formal and vocational education. We've heard the need for accredited training. There's a lot of accredited trainings out there that will build the capacity of youth, I think, in the Pacific. I think we need to build this pool of experts in the Pacific, and to do this, we can take advantage of these courses. And when you offer these scholarships, you can then attend these formal or vocational education that embeds climate change or climate finance into it. USP Pacific TAFE offers program management, proposal writing. I think these are key things. In order to be able to access that climate finance, you need to know how to write proper or good proposals, good project proposals. And once you've done that, you need to know how to implement projects. And these courses are available in terms of project management, even in climate finance, in asset management. These are courses that are available out there, and we should be allowed to give that opportunity to use these climate finances to fund this kind of suite of activities out there. And I think, again, mentoring and apprenticeship program I mentioned before, we can create that at whether it's at institutional level or at national level, even sub-regional, form a Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian sub-regional groups, and then exchange within each other, and then look at it at the whole region. I think these are initiatives that the youth should think about, and in terms of building their own capacity, so that they're ready and they're positioned well to access climate finance and effectively use these climate finances, so that it is effective to the beneficiaries, which are the communities. I think secondly, we need to look at developing strong tracking systems. Look at monitoring and evaluation systems to monitor the climate finances that are being out there. Climate finance is across all sectors, but I think you need to be able to capture these things in these elements of climate finance in the agriculture, fisheries, etc., and bring them all together, so that you can then look at how these finances are effectively contributing to the development of our communities. And I think at the end, I think Moortaza mentioned it, I think climate finance should be about development at the end. And then last, I think one other area, the last area is looking at blending finances. I think too often we're too focused on, okay, we'll just focus on one financing institution and we'll approach them with one proposal. I think we should look at a suite of blending climate finances, whether it's bilateral and multilateral, or national and bilateral, or GCF and adaptation fund. I think project proposals should be allowed, or funding institutions should allow the opportunity for this blending of finances, whether it's to scale up an initial activity or whether it's to implement the whole program across. I think even Dylan mentioned when you're looking at a program and versus project initiatives. Third slide, please. And just the last question that was really put up there was, what is our organization doing in terms of this? We've been fortunate enough that we've worked with USP Pacific TAFE in terms of developing and delivering accredited country trainings to our member countries. We work in 10 countries. And COVID has allowed us to rethink how to deliver these courses, and it's been delivered online, fully online, and it's been quite successful in that sense. But there is a hunger for that education or the need for those accredited training out there. And I think our climate finances, the ones that we are able to access, should be used to support these kind of needs. Secondly is professional development. Institutions should look at professional development of our youth, whether it's in terms of attachment, volunteers, or apprenticeship. These are things that I think will help, again, build the capacity of institutions. And when you have consultations, make sure everyone is included, whether it's a small group or a big group, whether it's the youth, the adults, or the women, or the men. I think being inclusive, I think is the key to the consultation. And we've tried with all our consultations, whether it's developing our own country program or developing project proposals, we've tried to ensure that all consultations are being inclusive. I think I'd probably stop there so that we allow questions. But I think the focus of my input really is about capacity and building the capacity so that we set the stage well for the Pacific before we did access those climate finances. Enough.
Thanks so much, Noah. Just really quick, time check. I know that we have 2 minutes remaining for the session, so we might go over by at least, say, another 10 minutes. I just want to get, if there are any initial feedbacks from everyone's comments, and then maybe if we could answer just one question, and then we can kind of end the session. But I just really wanted to get everyone's input on what has been said and what is going to be said. But for Noah, thank you so much. You said a lot about capacity of Pacific Island countries as opposed to climate versus climate finance. The real need for self-assessment, the use of climate finance for scholarships in the formal and informal sector, and how that can be used as a financing mechanism for these initiatives. And momentum building towards these bigger events. And I would push back actually on that point, saying that, when we come to, a lot of funding becomes available as we approach these big events. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation in terms of that. And in terms of leveraging systems, you talked a lot about education reform, and I completely agree. In my personal opinion, we need to transition from a rote-based learning system to a more critical thinking system that encourages innovation and critical thought. And that's something that I've been a proponent of in the spaces that I enter. And yeah, the definite need for strong tracking systems and amazing work that your organization is doing in supporting accreditation training, in professional development, and in encouraging participation. So thank you for that. So now I'm just going to really quickly open up the floor. If any of our panelists have anything to say in response, to add to anything, the floor is yours.
I might just start because there's a question that's directed to me from Sivendra Michael in terms of building the capacity of young Pacific people through various ways. However, how about contextualizing of these learning methods? I think these are opportunities that we can all explore, and we should be having that conversation with these institutions. We've got tertiary institutions in the region, and I think we should be talking with our tertiary institutions to be able to mold and develop these courses, whether it's just taking up one course that develops into one whole program, or just taking that course specifically because of you're interested in just climate finance, or you're just interested in project management. But these are courses that are available out there that are accredited, and people actually, I think the message that we were getting from the public was that they wanted accredited training, not only so that they could probably validate their position in that space that they're talking in, but also to further their career in terms of a more accredited qualification. But I think, yes, I agree. How you deliver these courses, we started delivering the courses face-to-face before COVID. And then when COVID came, we had to really think about this. And then we had to talk to the institutions. We talked to USP, that whole discussion happened. And then it became a blended mode. And then when COVID happened with travel restrictions, we really had to think about, okay, we need to still deliver the course because it's still a demand out there. But how do we deliver it, and how do we make it attractive to the audience? It's I think online learning is not the easiest. Connectivity is not the easiest in the Pacific, but we were able to do that. Allow more time, allow flexibility in how you deliver these courses, and etc. I hope that's answered your question, Sivan.
Absolutely, and he's dropped in the chat, absolutely, with multiple Ys. So I guess that was a great answer. Did anyone else have anything to add? I'm looking at the Q&A section. There's a question for global climate, the Green Climate Fund. Sorry, there are a few other questions. I'm just going to. What I'm going to do is, if you feel the urge to address one of them, if you feel the urge to address comments or make comments, I'm just going to open up the floor. If not, I will direct questions, and then I will close the session. So the ball is in the pot.
Dylan, if I can make very brief intervention regarding the two thoughts that were posed in the chat room, which were very thought-provoking. So regarding Catherine's comment on how these climate funds, including ourselves, can ensure that there is a good and robust scrutiny in a way that we operate things. So at the GCF, we have various independent mechanisms to ensure such accountability. We have independent units that are responsible for evaluation of our performance, our integrity, and also the readiness mechanism. So that's one arm of the system. And second, we have also internalized very robust policies and standards within the framework of ESG. And we would like to use those tools in a manner to enhance our ability to ensure strong integrity. And also, I think it's important to establish very strong tracking systems in order for us to be accountable to the demands given to us. And we recently adopted a system called Integrated Result Management Framework for us to better operate under this mandate. Abbas has shared very interesting and great comment how the youth groups can receive support directly from the GCF. So I think one of the messages that resonated in me from this session is that it is really important to empower the youth and make sure their voices are heard within the relevant political processes. So as for GCF, there are a number of channels where we interact directly with the countries, and there are government entities and international organizations who create channels to receive the voices and ideas from various stakeholders and constituencies. And I think it would be really important for the youth group to really raise the issues and the interests to these groups, so that we can incorporate your ideas within the funding proposals and within the readiness grant proposal that we receive from these various stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've seen in the chat that Moortaza, you wanted to respond to a question that was directed to you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, there was I think that there's a question there by Josiah Tokoni, which I think is the $1 million question. I think that is where the buck stops. Is it reaching the communities that it was intended for? You know, with the right quantity and the right quality in a sustained manner. I think that is the question. That's the question we should always hold ourselves. Any discussion, anything we do, if we need to be able to answer that question collectively. And I don't proclaim to have the answer, but from experience of managing a change program in the Pacific over the last several years with so many different partners, it's not easy. But I think it's possible. And if we see it as a suite of the right kind of ingredients, some of which are already there, some of which are not. And I think youth forums, youth groups can fill up a lot of those missing links. And so the kind of missing links and ingredients that we're seeing in some of the experimental work that we're doing in the region that I mentioned before, I think it's not just about engaging communities and stakeholder consultations in formulating a climate finance proposal. You know, that just really touches the edge of it. I think it goes deeper, and again, it's the systems. What are the systems in place that are there naturally to continuously connect with communities on a regular basis before, during, and after any kind of climate finance intervention, whether they're formal or informal, and what's the work that's required to strengthen that? And you know, one thing we're seeing is that there's so many different worlds here. There's the world of communities, NGOs, civil society, and so on. And then there's the formal world of budgeting and planning, policies and processes that link from local government to national governments, then lead to, you know, discussions with donors and that. And there are so many broken links there. And it's a really hard thing to do, but we're seeing already prospects, like in the countries I mentioned. But if we can work on strengthening those links, marrying the two worlds, getting that voice in, but translating it into the formal language of budgeting, PFM, public financial management. People have been talking about economics, translating into economics, so that the two worlds can understand each other better. These are the kinds of raw ingredients, I think, that will instigate that change and ultimately allow financing to reach the needs of the communities. So again, very powerful, pivotal role of youth groups at the frontier of the future. Thanks so much for that question, and please do keep asking that question. Nafa.
Thanks so much, Moortaza. And I see that Ilisapeci has an intervention as well. May I just add before she takes the mic, Ilisapeci, if you could deliver your intervention, but then also kind of deliver any other final comments that you would like to make, and then I'll extend that to the rest of the panelists that are here. Any final comments to kind of round out the discussion, that would be great. So I won't come in again except to thank us for coming on here and directing us to the next session, but you guys will just take over. But before that, I just wanted to touch on what Moortaza just said about broken links and, you know, the language, what is lost in translation. And that is definitely something that we need to look at. And for me, the word that really pops out is intersectionality, you know, not looking at climate finance in isolation. And I know a lot of you have touched on this already in terms of, you know, capacity building, in terms of educational reform. These are all the intersecting elements that need to be addressed alongside climate finance, alongside all of these other issues. So the intersectionality is definitely important to look at. So with those words, I'm gonna leave it to Ilisapeci, and then maybe if we go Ilisapeci, then we go Moortaza again, Hansol and Noah. So basically your introduction schedule, and just to round up the discussion, that'd be great. Thank you, Ilisapeci.
Vinaka Dylan, that's a great summary from you. I just wanted to just add on in terms of the importance of accountability, yeah? And the issue of tracking systems. So we've heard one of the tracking tool that Hansol had mentioned, and also Moortaza had spoken briefly about the public finance management system that we have, and assessments that have been conducted here in the region. Now, I would want to come, and I think this is the question that's been coming up really clearly, from community up to the national level. There's a lot that is happening up at the national level, and in terms of tracking, but how about tracking at community level to help them decide well what's best for them and bringing it up for decision-making purposes? So Oxfam, in partnership with the World Resource Institute, they worked on a tracking tool called the AFI tool, or the Adaptation Finance Accountability Initiative tool. Now that has been trialed, it has been successful in Africa, in our regions in Africa. So what Oxfam in the Pacific is doing now, we're kind of like doing last year, work with our colleagues in Solomon Islands through one of our social accountability project in Solomon Islands to try and contextualize the tool that could be used at community level. So communities themselves, groups themselves able to do the tracking and getting out the information to help inform their decision back to their provinces, back to subnational level, as well as to at the global level. So this is one of the tools that is currently in the make, and we are happy that we've got support from the New Zealand government to pursue on the project, and we will be contextualizing this tool. So that's, I just wanted to reassure those of you that are coming in, they will be one that we will be working together to try and build that gap from community upwards. So on that word, thank you so much for the great questions that have been coming, and Dylan for your excellent moderating skills, and also to my colleagues Moortaza, Noah and Hansol for the informative session. It's been really great, particularly to be challenged by youth on our ways of working moving forward. Vinaka.
Moortaza, and then Noah. I guess Hansol has unfortunately left us. So.
Thanks, Dylan. I realize time is tight, so I just have one practical observation and perhaps challenge for any colleague that is part of a youth group working collectively or individually. I think a lot of the time in this space, whether it's on social media or in live forum like this, I have to admit, a lot of if you break it down, a lot of the messaging is a little bit on the negative side, you know, and that's understandable, that it's a big problem. We're suffering, we're not included, you know, it's not enough money, it's not being done right, you know, and that's absolutely fine. But I just would like to suggest that I think one core ingredient to shift the dial in this is for youth groups, who I think have the most power to do this, is to bring a positive energy to the dialogue. So yes, complain, challenge, attack, voice, be heard, but do that with a layer of positivity, with a layer of innovation, with a layer of foresight, and the brilliance that you already bring. Thanks, that's all from me, and really appreciate this opportunity, and can't wait for more. Naka.
Thank you. From my side, I guess one of the statistics that I saw before joining this event, today actually the world has the largest youth cohort in history. And we all know that the issues of addressing climate change is particularly important to this group. I mean, for instance, we see there's a significant correlation between impact of climate change, and the high unemployment rate for the youth. So forums like this today is truly helpful for us to understand what is the problem in hand and how we can tackle those in a most efficient manner. I learned a lot from this discussion and from the comments shared by the various participating members, and I take a wealth of wisdom from this engagement. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, Dylan, thank you again for the opportunity to speak in your forum. It's quite enlightening and quite encouraging to see the youth that are out there, and they're quite active. And again, I think my key message is don't wait to be included, get yourself included. And whether it's in education or anything, but let's make sure that we are ready. Build your skills, build your experience, and get yourselves out there. And as Moortaza said, yeah, positive energy is probably the best way to go, rather than looking at it. There is that negative impact, but look at it in terms of tackling it from a positive angle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you to all the amazing panelists for joining us. Thank you to Jay, our tech support. Thank you to our interpreters, Mary Vinaka. Thank you for joining. Thank you for thank you to everyone else that have been joining in our conversation. We have a few questions that are still kind of floating around this chat. Our rapporteurs, we actually have rapporteurs that are taking notes as we've been speaking. So those will be noted down as well. So to the panelists, if you're interested in receiving a copy of the questions, please let me know and I'll be happy to forward them to you, just to get you thinking more about the issue and engaging with young people. Awesome, thank you so much. After this, I believe, give me 1 second. We are going to be moving into a workshop session, so please feel free to join. Thank you so much for joining us. And from here in Suva, from the Youth for Pacific team, over and out. Thank you so much.